Hello, everyone, and good evening. I hope everyone's well at home. Tonight's topic for discussion is deaf education, and deaf education in particular in Scotland. Tonight's talk discussion will be about Scotland. As will be aware, Scotland is very proud to have our Bsl Act that was enacted in 2015. And since then, we've been creating local plans via the local authorities, the NHS, colleges, universities, and many, many other organisations. And that's been happening throughout Scotland. Recently, there was a report created looking at specifically deaf education since the Bsl Act. So I thought what a wonderful opportunity would be to get a couple of the architects of this report to talk to us about this plan. Now, we're really excited that this is happening this week because a BSL bill in Westminster in the UK government's parliament will go through parliament this week. So I think it's just really timely that we're looking at Scotland and saying, how have we progressed since 2015 when in Westminster they're talking about just starting this journey? So I would again ask the audience to remember that this is about Scottish education. So can you keep your questions relevant? Also, if you've got any questions, please just drop them as normal in the comments box. There may be some questions we won't be able to answer, but hopefully we can signpost you in the right direction. So lastly, I just want to say, sit back, enjoy yourself, and I hope you enjoyed tonight's discussion. I'd like to introduce Rachel O'Neill, first of all. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, hello everyone. Hi.
Lovely to have you here. Rachel, could you just tell me just a wee bit about who Rachel is?
Okay, so I work at in Edinburgh at the university, and I work as a teacher of those people who will become teachers of deaf children. So I teach the teachers.
Wow,
I also
wonderful.
research. I've done quite a lot of research into deaf education.
I've known for a long time, Rachel, that you've been a passionate advocate for deaf education. So I have questions for you that I'll give you later on. But before I do that, could I introduce Rob?
Okay.
Hi,
Hello.
Rob.
Hello. Hi. Nice to see you.
Rob, could you do the same? Introduce yourself.
Okay, I'm Rob Wilkes. I'm a lecturer. I'm based in the University of South Wales.
Okay.
And I teach law to hearing students.
Oh, you've frozen a wee bit there, Rob. Oh, we got you back.
Am I
Oh,
freezing? I do apologise.
could you just
Okay.
backtrack? We got the
So
research.
I'm also a research area. My research interests are areas of equality and human rights. So that's my area of research. So I teach and I research in law.
Lovely. So we've got Rob from South Wales and we get Rachel from Edinburgh. So we're going to have start with a few questions. Recently, your report was published about deaf education within Scotland, and this is what we want to talk about. So I think the first question, I have read the report, but could I ask, what was the reasons behind actually making the report? What was the reasons for doing it in the
Okay.
first place?
I think it was a question of perfect timing. I'd just been I just finished my PhD researching into equality law, but there didn't seem to be any equality law relating to deaf people particularly. And then I
Okay.
wondered whether sign language
So you
might
talking
the
about
recognition,
recognition?
yes, the
Right.
recognition of sign language. Um, when we got sign language recognition, I was wondering whether that meant deaf people became equal in law. And there was very little research about the impact of that sign language
Okay.
recognition on deaf communities. So you know, sort of retrospective, what happened after the recognition, really. I've got two deaf children, deaf girls.
Okay.
So and I know that Rachel I know that she's very strong in the area of deaf education research. So we thought, why don't we work together? We'd been
Ah,
working together previously on some work around the BSL Act in Scotland. So we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to look at the impact of that BSL Act on deaf education in Scotland? And so that we came up with that about two,
so
3 years ago.
so was that right, Rachel, 2 or 3 years ago? Could you tell me about how you were involved?
Sure. Well, we've known each other, as Rob said, because we have been colleagues in the past. And so we thought the first step would be to research, we will do documentary research as a method. And we chose that method because it meant, it's so difficult to reach out to people in the community and interview everybody you want to eat, to meet. So we thought that we would investigate all the plans that all the local authorities had to
Oh,
make.
a deaf
And
teacher?
also there's a forum, a deaf teachers forum, which we thought was interesting. So we agreed that we got permission from them to use their chat history.
Ah,
I think that was from 6 years, I think. So going back quite a way, they agreed as long as we anonymized that information. So we used a documentary approach rather than an interview approach. However, we do hope for the next step 2, to move on to interviewing people. So really, this is only the first part of our
so
report. It's the
it's
first
like
stage, as it were.
part 1, if you like, on your journey, and that we expect
Exactly
maybe
so.
part 2.
Yes,
Okay,
and there's more to
lovely.
be done.
So it's a work in progress, really. Could I ask you also, when you were gathering evidence, was that from BSL plans, from local authorities? Actually, just logistically, how did you get that information? And also the teachers, that the group that they shared, how did you manage to find out where these people were in the organizations? Curious.
Okay, well, obviously we knew where everybody was because the council plans are all available on their websites. That
Okay.
they're obliged to do that. So colleges and universities are also expected to have plans. Um, So there are national groups as well, like the SQA, the GTCS, all of these kind of teaching organisations and bodies, Education Scotland. All of these people are expected to produce their own plans. So, in a sense, that data was already there. The Deaf Teachers Group I knew already existed. Because I know all of the teachers who are part of that group, so that was helpful.
So was the people, were they all deaf, or was it a mixture of deaf and hearing?
The deaf teachers group, everybody in that group is deaf. However, some use speech as their preferred method of
Okay.
communication, some use signs, some use both. So it's a mixture in that sense.
So really you were getting the information from the
Their
chat
chat
group.
history, yes, their chat history, which was 6 years. Yes, it was kind of a weird thing, but yes, they gave us permission
Fantastic.
for that.
Well, that's just so good because that shows you sort of real time over a period and how people were adjusting. And then if you think about COVID happening, and the effect of that's had in education, so that the timing of this report could not be any better. You know, education is part of everybody's life, but it's part
Yes,
really important deaf education. And we know that people over the years have a positive and negative experience, but
yes,
this report has given us something to focus on and to look at and look for solutions too. So this is a copy I've got to show our viewers at home. This is the report. I
yes,
have been reading it, been doing my homework, but could I ask you, is there a BSL version of this report?
yeah,
There is?
yes. So there's a website where all the information in that report is posted, but there are also summaries available in BSL.
Ah,
And there is a BSL translation of the entire report as well, if you want to
lovely,
take time to look at that. Yeah, there are both of those things.
lovely. So just to say the website, we'll show a wee tag. There you go at the bottom. This is
Great.
the website you have to go to. So if anybody wants to know about deaf education, follow that link, and that will take you to the BSL version. Is that right, guys? Yes,
Yes, that's
fantastic.
correct.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Moving on. Thank you. Now I want to dig deeper about your report. I've had a look at your report and I've been having a chat with lots of people and we've been sharing our views. So I've come up with a few questions for you. Could you maybe, if you, from your own personal view, what you think are the key areas of concerns or maybe some areas that you're worried about within Scottish education for deaf people? Maybe a couple of points each.
Okay. We identified quite a few things, in fact. But if I had to pick out two as key themes, I would say that there's still a lot of confusion within the education system around deafness and disability, and whether sign language is a minority language. So there's confusion about that sort of status. So a lot of councils and public bodies in general are still under the preconception that deaf people are disabled, and so services should fall in line with that, rather than seeing deaf people as a linguistic minority or treating deaf people as a linguistic minority and looking at their language in relation to, say, other spoken languages, or
Okay, go
as an
back,
equivalent to
Rob.
that.
So what you're meaning is that there's maybe developing that are happening in education, but and it's happening within a disabled context rather than it being a sign language context. Is that what you mean?
Yes, I think there is room for both. In fact, there's room for both approaches, and sometimes it can be difficult to separate them. But the language part of that equation is not fully understood. People don't realize that BSL is not a communication tool. It's not a tool. It's not a kind of how to teach method for deaf children, like Makaton, say, something like that. BSL is actually a
Yeah.
language, just as English is, just as Gaelic is, or Gaelic is. So it's the same. And that realization is not yet happening.
I mean, you'll know, Rob, that people out there still are under the false assumption that Makaton or Paget Gorman is
Indeed.
actually a language. They're not. The- Uh, so just to reinforce that, Rachel, do you have something to add?
Well, I'm agreeing with Rob, really. Uh, when we read through the council plans, we found that their perception of language acquisition wasn't clear. So they were thinking of deaf babies, and they were thinking that they would give the mum a card about BSL with some information about BSL. But that's not enough. Of course, parents need a huge amount of support. They need language classes, they need to learn, they need to have contact with language users. So the plans that we read through, most of them didn't really get a didn't really understand language acquisition as a process. They didn't understand that. And that's part of understanding that languages take time, they need contact. You need to kind of
Rapport.
go to where people use those languages. If staff can't sign, how are the babies going to learn? Like in nurseries, how are the babies going to learn to sign? So you need lots and lots of hours of contact in a sign language nursery to be able to learn to sign.
So, Rachel, is it almost like they were just given, here you go, there's a pack, away you go and learn yourself? And
Exactly
maybe
so.
just,
Very often, certainly. Yeah.
ah, okay. Have you got any other worries or concerns?
Yes, one concern that I noted was, strangely, when they were making these plans, councils receive a sort of template from the Scottish Government. So the Scottish Government sends out these templates. And I don't know who's creating these, but very often when we read through these, we found a lot of reports had used this template. So there was a lot of provision, but they're talking about education, but the
Missing
actual
what?
teaching and learning was
Ah,
completely absent from this template. So they would talk about the children, they'd talk about their journeys to school, school trips, they'd talk about work experience, they'd talk about school leavers and transitions. Um, but nobody was mentioning anything about what was actually happening in the
could you get
classroom.
give us an
So there's an
example,
issue with the
Rachel?
template itself. Do you know what I mean? It's like, well, the template's like an example. So most councils will copy from each other. They'll produce something similar. Um, And yeah, they're not talking about teaching and learning. And the deaf children's right to learn BSL, a deaf child's right to learn BSL is not
Mm.
mentioned. It's just not there because it's not in the template.
Okay, so do you feel that local authorities and the well, for they're doing their that they're actually looking at the national plan and then taking that, copying it, sort of tweaking it to make it their local plan? But what you're saying is what's missing. There's two bits missing. Was learning in
There
the
are gaps.
classroom as well as. So what would you like to see?
Oh, yes, I'd like to see that script change. I'd like to see a new template being sent out.
For all local authorities or just be some?
No, some councils have got it because they've got a good experience. They're doing bilingual education with deaf children, but I think there's only about 5 that I can think of, so 3/4 of them are not.
Okay. I mean, you've mentioned about the child's learning and the teaching experience. Is there any gaps maybe that you've noticed?
Yeah, another interesting thing is it does seem that there's a lot of focus on hearing children learning sign language rather than deaf children learning sign language, which is quite interesting, isn't it? So that has its pros and cons. I mean, it's great to encourage, uh, you know, deaf children. I mean, of course, it's great that hearing children are learning sign language. That's lovely. And it would be great that they can communicate with the deaf community in the future. But if the deaf community itself hasn't got access to learning sign
Yeah.
language, that's surely more important that they learn BSL first. So that's a real gap that we
Rachel,
identified.
how do you feel about that in
I
particular?
agree. I think it was interesting to see what's happening in Wales. So recently in Wales, a new curriculum has been launched and you'll be aware that Wales doesn't yet have its own Bsl Act, but what it does have is this curriculum which has BSL firmly rooted in it, which is fantastic. So yeah, great for deaf children. It's really clear deaf children have the right to BSL. It's very clearly stated there.
That's so interesting. So do you feel that when you've through your research that maybe that the new 1+2 program, which we're talking about for children having a second language, maybe that has encouraged. I mean, before it was just French and German spoken language. So do you think maybe what's happened is that there's an excitement there and they've started to promote that? But I agree with you. Is there other ways that the children, maybe our children, there should be things being done like the curriculum to ensure their rights are protected?
Well, yeah, I think another thing is that teachers, however you want to sign it, they need to have a very high standard of BSL. They need to have a really good level of BSL. And a lot of teachers for the deaf or other staff in schools um, really don't have that level of skill as yet. They have quite low level of skills. So they need more opportunities to learn BSL. They need more
Mm.
opportunities to meet people who use BSL because the teachers themselves don't have a good enough level. So better training for teachers of the deaf, I would say, to improve their BSL skills to the level that's required.
Rachel?
Yes, I'd agree. I think there are two ways to do that, and this is why we've got problems. One way is that the teachers themselves, one thing is that the teachers themselves, they want to learn BSL, but they don't know where to get it from. They're keen. They are keen. They are interested to learn BSL. They want to, but who's going to pay for their courses?
Yeah.
And another thing that's important is that deaf people can become qualified teachers so that they provide great role models and can push the standard up. Hearing teachers who have friends or colleagues who are deaf or have deaf children, you can see that they sign beautifully and their quality, their standard of signing is much higher.
I mean, you're absolutely right, Rachel. I mean, the teaching or the teacher standard of signing has not been great. And I know that you've mentioned that teachers should have a specific minimum. Do you think it should be a level 2, level 3, level 6?
Oh, Rachel. What's interesting is the government are soon going to be talking about this problem. I think it's going to be in February or March. They're beginning to discuss that problems about what the level of qualification needs to be. So perhaps our audience tonight needs to be looking out for invitations to that
Oh,
conversation. And
okay.
the government, well, hopefully it'll be interpreted, and so it will be accessible. But please, if you see an opportunity to make your views heard, please put your views forward. I think nearly all councils in Scotland have got SCQF level or above, level 6 or above.
Oh, level 6, okay.
Yeah, so it's a fairly high level, but they're recommending that, but they haven't got it yet. I
Ah,
think that's what the councils need to have.
I just need to clarify. So what we're saying is we would like to see that a minimum standard would be level 6 for teachers. Is that the
What
aspiration?
what I'm saying is, personally, this is a personal view. I think that all councils must have staff who can sign. You know, but of course they're not all going to have 100%. But I think a lot of people are going to work with deaf children who want to speak only, but I think staff should have those skills. I think they should be prepared. I mean, the Equalities Act of 2010 says you have to be prepared for a signing child to come into your classroom, and I think it's really important that we are prepared for that.
I just want to just drill down a wee bit more, Rachel. So I'm asking you, do you think that level 2, level 3, or level 6, what do you think is the minimum?
I think personally, level two should be the absolute minimum. Level 3 is the kind of aim, and hopefully, that will spread out.
So
But
this is
it
a
is a question
long-term
of
thing.
funding. It is a question of having more teachers to provide that training.
Rob, what about yourself?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question because I think if you're a teacher, you're teaching a language. Maybe you're teaching English, let's say, for example, or French, or something like that. You would expect to have a high level of that language. You would expect to have some fluency in the language in which you're expected to teach. Otherwise, how are you going to teach it? How are you going to teach a language that
Absolutely.
you don't know?
Yeah.
So when you think about level 1, level 2 BSL, this is still basic
Mhm.
conversational skill. It is not fluency. So I mean, you could talk about, the weather, or you could talk about having a cup of tea or something like that. But when you're talking about teaching language to children, if you're talking about teaching maths, if you're talking about teaching
Yeah.
English, if you're talking
Expect a
about
higher
teaching
standard.
science, you really need a much higher level of BSL. And that's what we're seeing now in mainstream schools, because the teachers of the deaf um, are taking on that responsibility, because deaf children themselves aren't meeting very many deaf people in the
Yeah.
community.
They're
So they've
asking
got
where
very
are they?
limited
Yeah.
exposure to BSL. They're relying on each other. So if they're relying on teachers, these teachers really do need to have a high level of BSL, because they're the role models. So I think it's really important the children are gonna learn from them.
Oh, thanks for that, Rob. While we were having that discussion, the questions were come flying in. So, what I'll maybe do is I'll just have a quick look at the question. The first question's in from Erin McCluskey. It will appear at the bottom of our screen. So, Erin's question is, what was your biggest challenge in conducting the research regarding gathering info and stats?
Okay, I'm happy to answer that. It's a good question, Erin. I think there were quite a number of challenges, because there were so many websites to look at. Some websites had very little information about in relation to the BSL Act at all. So it was really difficult to try and navigate the website, to find out what that council had done so far. Did they have their plan on their website? What had they achieved so far? It was really difficult to kind of excavate that information from the website. So that was one challenge. Another was that some councils, um,
Rachel,
well,
um,
maybe Rachel wanted to come in at this point.
I think maybe one of the challenges, but I have to say I really do enjoy the process of researching and finding information. I think one area that I found was the Deaf Education chat group. That was really interesting because we had that for such a long time, and we both were able to research all that plus all through all the websites. I mean, it was many, many hours and it was painstaking, but honestly, it was
That's the
so
challenge.
enjoyable. So I suppose the challenge is breaking through to try and get that information.
Yeah.
So did you find it hard being the pandemic, coronavirus then? Did that affect you in any way?
I think coronavirus wasn't a huge problem really, because what we were doing was already out there in the public domain before
Okay.
before the pandemic hit. So um, I think there might be the possibility that councils weren't able to update their websites, particularly because of coronavirus, and they were putting information about
Yeah.
getting
I
your
suppose there was
jabs
more
and
of
spread
a
of
focus
coronavirus.
on
So
health.
in a sense, that delayed updating information. So I suppose that would be the main impact.
Okay. Thank you for that response, Rob. Another question is coming in, and that's from Helen. Should appear at the bottom of your screen. Here it is. So Helen's question is, she wants to ask you what inclusive communication means to each of you. Is it part of a communication tool? Are educators confused about this term? What it actually means? So inclusive communication versus BSL. Can you
Ah, okay, so inclusive communication is really related to inclusive education theory. And that says everybody's better off going to their most local mainstream school. That's the premise of that. So in Scotland, we tend to follow the same policy, in fact. So that means that if a deaf child wants to mix with other deaf children who use sign language, then they have to travel out of their local area, which means they may have to pay for
yeah.
taxis. Some councils refuse to cover the cost of that travel. So inclusive communication should mean that sign language is provided, or hearing aids are provided, or speech therapy, or cochlear
So
implantation,
a
or
kind of
whatever.
mixture.
But it often means that children uh, sign to one friend, speak to another friend, so that they can be flexible in their communication approach.
Rob, it seems to be the fashion just now. We see this term inclusive communication, and I do think that people are confused and wondering the difference between that and BSL or sign language.
Yes, I think it relates to what I said to you before. This split, what I said before, this kind of split between whether we're talking about disability or whether we're talking about language. And this kind of
Yeah.
idea of inclusive communication is really a sort of disability type model, isn't it? Whereas it's not really particularly focused on minority languages. Um, and inclusive communication is useful for some deaf children. That kind of disability approach is useful for some deaf children, but we want to encourage both approaches and both aspects to that approach. So
Absolutely.
I think we need to currently swing the emphasis a little bit more towards the language side of things.
Okay, we have another question coming in. It should come at the bottom of our screen. Here it's coming. Is it Carrie? Oh no, Caro Hunter. Sorry, beg your pardon. So, question to both of you: what do you think about the provision of educational interpreters within schools?
Not much. When we looked into the plans from the councils, they were very rarely mentioned. Educational interpreters were very rarely mentioned. Colleges and universities sometimes talked about education interpreters,
Yeah,
yes,
that was
but
the same.
there was certainly one example from a university who I shan't name, that said, "I'm sorry, we can't find educational interpreters. We've looked, but don't really bother applying to this university because we can't find any," which is
Yeah.
an appalling attitude to put in a plan. And so the plan was positive, but the website was very, very negative. But educational interpreters working in schools, I think, are very rare. They're not really mentioned in plans.
Okay.
Personally, my personal view is it differs across Scotland. Sometimes you get people with level 3, which again is not really enough language to become an interpreter. I've seen a kind of advert for a CSW saying level 10, SQF 10, which is very high. That's similar to level 8 in England. But that's the only one I've seen. Most of them, they never use the word educational interpreter. They say CSW mostly. And obviously that doesn't provide very much support. They're not supervised. So it's a very difficult area.
We've got another question that's relating to that, actually. It'll come up. It's regarding communication support workers in education. But could I ask you, when you looked at the local authorities, you were saying there really was not much mention of BSL educational interpreters within school. Do you think that's something that we can focus on more?
I think educational interpreters, well, of course, they have a role. But I think they're more suitable to a mainstream setting. Okay. Now, if you're in a resource-based deaf unit, you don't need it because everybody signs. Everybody uses sign language communication. In mainstream, yes, possibly. But there's very little talk about that. And just while I'm on the subject, another thing coming back to what Rachel said about the availability of interpreters depending on where you're based in Scotland. If you're thinking about the Central Belt, then perhaps a university there or a college or a school within that Central Belt might have particular resources. But when you're out in other areas, rural areas particularly, it might be more difficult to find an interpreter who's going to have to travel further. So what we need is for colleges, university schools to share with each other, share resources, share best practice. So that's an issue at the moment.
So recommend sharing the interpreter or recommend sharing information?
I think it depends how the interpreters are used, whether it's a booking system, whether you're booking freelancers to come in, or whether you're using internal people. I think there is room to share those resources, is what I'm suggesting.
Like we used to have the old peripatetic teachers for the deaf, and maybe what we're doing is we maybe have peripatetic interpreters for the deaf, where they would maybe cover a few schools. I don't know, is that something to think about?
Possibly. And also some kind of possible online resource as well. That's also a possibility. There are courses where we've recommended having level 3 or level 4 because there are more of those people available. So colleges, BSL courses, we need more of those to provide those qualifications in the first instance.
Lovely. We have another question from Fiona Stewart. And our question, as I said, is related to what we were talking earlier about communication support workers, and was looking for a view of what you think of the current standard of CSWs.
Yes, I think, Rachel. Okay, I think that relates to what we were talking about before. And I think the government and the council should be paying, but they don't have much money. They're facing cuts themselves.
Absolutely.
So the government could decide. We know the government is trying to encourage the Gaelic, for example, but what about BSL and the resources and the training that we need to encourage that development of BSL? I was going to say the same thing, actually. Yeah.
Okay, we'll go back to the questions. They're coming in quick and fast. So this is a big question, and this is from Erin McCluskey. So I'll read it out for you all. I haven't been through the training to be a teacher of the deaf, but from what I've seen, it sounds as if it's really a lot of information and teaching on the hearing technology. So basically, it's on the ear. And so could you explain why that's happening?
Yeah, let me talk to that. Okay, so the government recommendations, which I think were created in 2007, so they're quite old, have just recently changed. We're in the process of change, of discussing updating them. So the course I teach, the teachers come from all over Scotland, and we have limited contact time. We have limited time in our classroom. So we look at communication, we look at audiology, we look at deaf studies, which is led by Dr. Audrey Cameron. We talk about curriculum for excellence. We talk about achievements in exams. We talk about literacy. We talk about well-being.
Lots and
So
lots of topics
in terms
there.
of learning BSL, it's not part of the course because of the number of hours we're trying to fit in here. But there is a government guidance minimum at the moment, and at the moment it's
Oh, hang
level
on
one.
a second. So, Rachel, you're saying
Level
the
one.
government's saying
The
the
government
minimum level
recommendation
one?
is level one, and it is the same for English, and it is in England and Scotland and Wales. But I think in Wales they're pushing that up now because it's now on the curriculum.
Okay, so we really need to have a new curriculum that
Yes,
actually
we'll
promote
get one.
a way higher level than that, promote
Exactly.
teachers of the deaf as well. But I mean, level one.
Level one is just not going to stay the same. Level one will get harder. I think that's under discussion, and councils are thinking that well, maybe they need a level three. The community are saying minimum a level three. I'm sure there'll be some debate around that, but hopefully we're going to raise that standard because it needs raising.
So I suppose Erin's question is asking that in the future, is there plans for a consultation or review and actually to upgrade these standards?
There is a review coming, yes, and I think that starts. I think in March. It's scheduled for March. Fingers
Lovely,
crossed.
lovely. We'll watch this space then for any more information. Thank you so much for that,
Yes, please
Rachel.
do. Please respond.
We have another question in from Magella, and Magella's asking for mainstream schools, does the Scottish Government provide qualified interpreters or CSW workers for deaf pupils? Obviously, both interpreters and CSWs are differently skilled.
Mhm.
So, Rachel, what do you think?
No is the answer. No. CSWs don't have any particular training courses.
Okay,
Interpreters are rarely, usually rarely find interpreters in those settings.
okay. Rob, anything to add?
Well, again, what I mentioned before, when we did our documentary research, there was very little mention of interpreters. There was very little mention of CSWs actually as well. There was the only thing was communication support in the classroom. That's all we found, but there's no further evidence than that.
Okay, this has been great. There's been lots of questions coming in. We've covered, the interpreters, lots of them about CSWs, and it seems to be our audience are really looking for changes in the minimum standards. That
Yeah.
seems to be a lot, it's contentious for a lot of people because people are looking for the right to access education in the same way, in a fair way, and everyone else, and they're not getting supported as much. So maybe you um I've heard young people saying, I'm teaching the teacher how to sign. It
Yeah.
shouldn't be that way. It should be the other way around.
Yeah.
The young people should be taking the information from the adult, the teacher there. So maybe your report, we were talking about the next stage, or maybe there's a separate chapter on CSWs and interpreters.
Hopefully, the next part could be that we do interviews. We are planning to do interviews, but maybe we might do something comparative between Wales and Scotland. So hopefully, we'll start interviewing some interpreters or CSWs as well.
Sounds
Um,
good.
but we might be interviewing council managers, the people who make the plans, universities and colleges, the people who create the plans there.
I think that's a great idea. It would be lovely to see all the councils involved in that
Yeah.
and actually, say to them, have you thought about these other things? Because it could be that they haven't even thought about it. And I just think timing just now is perfect because we've
Absolutely.
got our national plan, but the local plans are they're living documents. They change all the time. They have to be reactive and also proactive by taking reviews. So, and back to my next question, I'm trying to get as much in as possible. The next question I have to you is really is to talk about Scotland's SQA, the Scottish Qualifications Authority. For people at home, just so as you know, that when anybody has exams and you get your certificate, it's the SQA that authorise that. We've also got another acronym for you, and that's the General Teaching Council Scotland, and that's for graduates that when they become a qualified teacher, they can join the GTCS. So can
I
you a
could
wee bit
talk
of
about the
explanation?
GTCS in general, the General Teaching Council, and perhaps, Rachel, you want to handle the SQA? So the
Lovely.
GTCS is, the biggest issue here is that, teachers of the deaf's expectations, right? So they go to university, they get qualified, and they have to do a probationary year.
Is that like a work placement? The 1-year work
It's
placement?
like a 1 year, so a year after they've
So that you
graduated.
yeah, you go to school and you're observed. Is that right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and that it's only at the end of that year that you're fully qualified. So during that probationary year, a lot of deaf teachers find problems, find barriers in
Okay.
that part of
Why
the
is that?
process. Usually they cope pretty well at university because access is provided, there are interpreters and so on. But when they're doing that probationary year, they have to go on placement in a school,
Mhm.
not necessarily with deaf children. It could be a mainstream school with full of hearing kids.
And
And
new
so
to
during
them?
that probationary year, there are difficulties, there are barriers. Um, there's access to work to deal with. First,
Okay.
they have to get funded that in the first instance so that they can pay for interpreters. Then they're dealing with the attitudes of their colleagues, their managers within the school. They may be being observed during their probationary year. There's perhaps no interpreter present for that during that observation. So, how are they being observed? How are their skills being noted? So, there are a number of issues there, a number of difficulties. So we've had meetings with the GTCS and we talked to them about working with the deaf teachers group
Okay,
to
that's
try
good.
and improve that situation going forward. So yeah,
So
yeah,
just go back a wee bit, Rob, just to summarise. The General Teaching Council, that's right. So once you've actually passed all your exams, you have to go there and then they
that's
give
right.
you your authority, they give you a placement.
You do.
So it could be a hearing school. Could I ask? Could I go to a deaf school? Or do they decide? Could I not say to them, look, I'm deaf, it would make more sense me going to a deaf school?
Yeah. What's possible now is that the deaf teachers group, because they've been advocating for this, they've been trying to persuade the GTCS to change their mind and to accept, for example, working in a resource-based school where there's deaf people in mainstream, or those kinds of experiences that might be better suited. Um, because what the deaf teachers group has found is a lot of the supervisory staff or colleagues who are responsible for them have very negative attitudes. They've had quite bad experiences.
So I suppose what we're probably saying is that if you're going into a familiar place
Yes,
where they
would be better.
understand your needs, then you don't have the same stress and anxiety. But the
Exactly.
problem is if you go somewhere else, then there's an extra burden because you then have to apply for access to work to try and
Yes, which
mitigate
takes
that.
time and is complex.
So like if you were comparing it to other people, other people coming in, they focus and worry as being observed, but for a deaf teacher, they have a lot more additional pressures.
Exactly, and that's a lot more stress. And so when they finish their probationary year, things get better, but that probationary year is really hard. So hopefully, as we said, the GTCS now is going to be in dialogue with the Deaf Teachers Group. And so hopefully, because of that, Rob, me, and Dr. Audrey Cameron have been to a preliminary meeting with the GTCS, and we're hoping that's going to be the first of
Great.
many. So hopefully, that position is going to change and improve.
Could I ask just a question that when people get their letter to say they're going to a certain school for a probation, has there been your experience that anybody's quit as a result of that?
There is, well, it's not exactly a dropout rate, but people have certainly considered it. Yeah, a
Okay.
lot of people, and some people do. Yeah, it's very, very stressful. Yeah,
I could just imagine.
as I say, I mean, I've recently seen one deaf teacher in their probationary year be successful because before they started, they did deaf awareness training, they did sign language training in the school, and the
Wow.
whole thing went much better. So there are tools for improving that situation.
I mean, just referring back to the BSL Act of 2015, do you think it's improved the situation or has it not made an iota of a difference?
Well, the Act doesn't really say much about that. It says a lot about creating plans. Um, So what we need to see are good quality plans. We need to see an improvement in the quality of plans, really.
Rob, how about yourself? Anything to add?
Just the other thing that came to mind is the GTCS. You have to register with a GTCS, and they've got a website. So all the different teachers have to register on that. But at the moment, there is no way of discerning from that website who's qualified or who's experienced to work with deaf children. So that's another thing that
Ah,
we need to address.
is it almost like the interpreters website where like you could have their photograph and see what areas
Similar,
of expertise they're in, that kind of idea?
similar. Actually, the GTCS is kind of in discussion with they're thinking about setting up a register for teachers of the deaf. So hopefully there'll be a name and then your level of sign language
Oh,
skills.
lovely.
So that but that's not available on the website yet. That's a possibility for the future.
Oh, but yeah, that's still good though, because I'm just thinking about when you look at the Scotland Ag website, there's lots of signposting to different plans.
Yeah.
And you can see them, and I'm looking that, registered teachers of the deaf, if you had something like that that they were signing, it's just so visual. The impact would be amazing, not just for professionals, but for the children, the young people themselves, and their parents. So let's hope that the General Teaching Council will continue working with you and look about how they can change things for the better.
Yep. And the SQA, which is the exam body, at the moment in Scotland is going through a lot of change. There are a lot of changes
Okay.
in education. The SQA at the moment, in the future might change its name, it might change all kinds of things, I don't know. Um, but deaf children in Scotland have a right to have their exams in sign language. But it's very difficult to find information about that on the SQA website that's in sign language that's informing deaf children about their rights. It's
Is
just not
that
there.
I just need to clarify,
Yes,
Rachel. That's right. You're allowed to do that in sign language.
yes, and the information about that is available for teachers, but for young people who are themselves kind of trying to find out their rights in terms of access to exams and whatever, it's not there. Some councils are very nervous about providing exams in sign language because it's very complex. You've got to have the right staff, you've got to have the
Ah,
right levels, sign language skills need to be good, translation skills need to be good, you need to have your camera skills and all sorts of things.
yeah, so lots of
And so,
things.
yeah, a lot of councils are quite scared of it. But really, the SQA um, need to put on their website that deaf people have a right to have their exams in signing. It's available there. Just ask your teacher.
Well, maybe, that's something that everyone has to promote. And if that was promoted,
It's a exam.
that would be
Yeah,
really good. It also gives people options. They can have an informed choice, and
yeah,
and that's just what we want. So from now, what happens from
yes.
the report? Do you continue to chat to them?
Well, we've been trying to get through to them for years. So if you all help us try, I'm sure that we'll get through eventually.
Absolutely. I'm just going to look through the list of questions, see if I can select one for us. Um, we've got a question in from Sam. And Sam's question is, I think and hope that BS will become a recognised and legal language in England. What are the panel's thoughts and hopes for the bills?
That's an interesting question, Sam. I think, well, it's interesting particularly because there is the BSL Act in Scotland. And of course, we can learn
Uh-huh.
from what's happened in Scotland, what's worked well, what hasn't worked quite so well, and also the way that the Act has come about, the process, of the planning and the local plans, and then the review structure and all of that. So I think it's interesting whether the model will be taken from Scotland or whether we'll come up with something completely different.
I suppose it's
Um,
too early to say.
yeah, it is interesting to see what happens in the future, isn't it? And hopefully something will happen. And I think, yeah, we've just got to kind of push for it and hopefully it's going to come.
Oh, brilliant. Fiona Stewart has got the same question, but you've already answered it, and it was regarding exams. So we've actually answered this question. There's Fiona's at the bottom of the screen. We
Yes,
have
there should be.
answered
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah.
I think we have answered it because Rachel's already answered that and said that, yeah, we have to. There's more information, but we need. We've already explained about you have the right to have your exams interpreted and everything else. Is there anything else I've missed? I think Rachel really has answered that. So,
And and
Rachel, sorry.
I think the BSL bill, the UK BSL bill in London, is it for the UK or is it only England? That's a question for Rob, actually. Okay, because
Oh,
we've got one in
the
Scotland.
UK. Okay. Interesting.
Mm, mm.
So, a question in from Barbara Burns. And her question is, one problem for our colleagues is access to BSL courses. We've spoken about that as well. As we've said, some of them could be far away from where you live and just finance as well. How do we overcome this?
If I can reply to that, I think nowadays, particularly with coronavirus and the pandemic, more people are learning online. So there are more advanced courses available online, and there are pros and cons to that. The advantage is that you get very skilled teachers, access to skilled teachers. The disadvantage is that you miss out on local sign variation. Um, so if you can visit your local deaf community, get involved
Absolutely.
in your community, make friends with people locally, get to know your local signs, but do online courses to utilize the best teachers from the UK, because there are some fantastically qualified and skilled skilled and experienced teachers out there. You get the best of both worlds.
Could I just say something else? What was it? I forgot what I was going to say. Sorry, Avril. So we've got another question in now from Kieran. And his question is about the fact that there's so many deaf organisations closing, and there just doesn't seem to
Yep.
be the route to attain a level 6 in BSL. It really is quite difficult. Have you got
Mm.
any suggestions?
One of the recommendations in our report, in fact, is that universities and colleges need to provide more BSL courses, because the Bsl Act is to promote BSL across Scotland. So we need to have more courses available. Of course, for more courses, you also have to have more teachers. So we need a supply of teachers who can teach BSL. Do we have enough qualified teachers? And so the whole thing, you have to unpick a number of issues to get to there. But yes, we definitely need it.
So what you're saying is like what we need to do is make sure we've got this bank of BSL
Absolutely.
teachers to actually start teaching. We need that quality to be robust. I mean, we can't have it the other way around. Doesn't make sense.
And I would say we should be looking at colleges. There are very few colleges in Scotland who have advanced courses. Um, you know, for teachers, for parents, for communication support workers, all of them need to have local access to high level courses. So colleges need to plan. Government should be informing colleges um, that and if they need funding to set up those courses for level 1, level 2, level 3 BSL, that should be encouraged. I think they need to take responsibility for that.
Well, I think that's one of the things. I mean, we're looking at local colleges and local areas that they have their own plans. I mean, we should be encouraging people, to travel locally as well and use the local resources. So I've got another question from Erin. She's super excited tonight. And her question is, what are your concerns and what do you think is great regarding the fact that young deaf people are achieving a higher pass rates in their SQA exams?
Um, I think really a lot of issues that we've brought up through this discussion are pertinent to that. You can't get high level signing from a teacher who doesn't have high level skills. There are always these issues involved in acquisition and what learning looks like in the classroom. Do you have
Okay.
access to BSL? Are you expected to lip read? Are you, are there barriers to your learning in an integrated setting? And we all know that there are issues. We all know that there are problems. We all know that there are some solutions, but they will take time. So a lot of the things that we're talking about are solutions, like making sure there are more teachers of the deaf with high-level
Okay.
BSL skills.
More deaf
These
role
things are
models, for
going to take
example.
time. So time is really important, and we won't see the results yet from what we're talking about now. We're not going to see those results for a few years.
It's the
So
next really the
that
next
means
young
that
people.
children who are being born now might have a different educational journey, but you can't provide overnight solutions. These things are 10 years hence, I think, but we will hopefully see real change.
Well, I mean, if we're going back to what sort of Erin's question, and we look at how we if you have a good education, good resources, good attitude, good CSW, good deaf teacher, then your
Good,
journey could be excellent because you've had
please.
access
Yeah.
to all that. However, the same as if you've not had that, it could maybe affect your health, your mental health, if your journey has not been as good. I would love to see more deaf teachers, because just deaf teachers in their very being are deaf role models as well, and they will have that instant rapport and understanding with the young people. I'm just looking at my questions. I think I've covered most of them, but there's one area I wanted to talk about, and it was about young people's human rights within education.
Human rights, oh, that's tricky. Really, the Bsl Act and the plans, the local plans, council plans that don't really talk about human rights at all. In the UK, there's no language right. Yeah, there's no formal, like the Equalities Act talks about that your right to certain equalities, and you have human rights, but only in limited domains. So, for example, if you're in prison or if you have to go to court, or um, in terms of family life and privacy and those kinds of things. So there are those issues that are quite clear,
Okay.
but in terms of education and certainly in terms of language, not so much.
But Rob, did the UN not have a charter, about your rights to language within from the Charter on People with
Yes,
Disabilities?
yes, that's right. And there's a convention on human rights for people with disabilities, and sign language is mentioned in that. And it does talk about the right to
Well,
education and well-being. But the problem is that the United Nations is an umbrella organization. It's an international umbrella organization. And really, the UK and the Scottish governments and the Irish governments and the Welsh government um, are, should follow the UN
yeah,
Convention. They should. But how that's enforced, if a
mm,
problem comes up, for example, or there's an issue, or maybe your PIP is turned down, you could go to court.
yeah.
Um, but if a child is not getting their right to education in BSL, can you can you challenge your council? Um, because UN law doesn't really affect UK law. It should, but it doesn't really have that kind of relationship. So the UK lawmakers could just ignore the UN, or they could, it has to go through the Scottish and UK law and the courts first. So there are barriers before you can get to the UN and say, hey, can you support me in this human rights? So yes, in spirit, that UN convention is there. That's exactly what we want. In reality, it might be slightly
Okay.
more difficult.
Rachel, do you agree? Have you anything else to add?
I have nothing to add. Yeah, yeah. I'm going to leave the law
Thank
to my
you.
colleagues here.
I mean, would you believe we're nearly at an hour? Your report, or the summary of the report, what are the next steps? We've been talking tonight. I know you've said we'll have part two, part three, and it is a living document that's going to continue. But what do we have to do, or what do you have to do, or collectively do to get to the next stage? Do you want to me
Me
answer
or
first?
I think phase two is the next bit. So we've got funding. What we want to do is begin to interview people, talk to people about their
Who would be the
experiences.
people?
Well, maybe talk about
Young deaf
yeah,
people,
young
okay.
people, maybe talk to people who represent national bodies, maybe talk to people who represent governments,
Governments,
maybe
councils.
talk to teachers of the deaf, maybe, different populations, maybe interpreters as well, as Rachel mentioned before, maybe interpreters. So
Yes,
a
their
wide
views.
variety of people, a broad church. So really, we want to kind of pick out a number of themes from the report, like we talked about before, deafness, seeing deaf people as a language minority or seeing deaf people as a disability. Want to look into those kind of themes a bit more, explore with people in interviews what they think about those, what they think about the kind of theories that underlie some of this planning. We want to compare, as Rachel said before, perhaps Wales and Scotland, because Wales has got BSL in the curriculum, whereas Scotland doesn't have that yet. It's got a bill, so they're different journeys, and maybe compare them from the perspective of a deaf child taking a journey. Do they have a similar journey? Do they have a different journey? Is it better? Is the journey better if you have the Bsl Act to support you, or is it better if you have a curriculum to support you? So we're kind of looking at that. I think phase 2 is going to be interesting.
Yeah, I would say that it's interesting. I think we'll definitely continue with this body of work. I'd like to focus on it in the early years, from cradle right up to the nursery. Because when I think about language acquisition from deaf babies, and when and also when you look at hearing babies that are learning sign and speech sometimes at the same time, that is just, it's not getting provided for those babies, and they need that contact time with other language users. So I think for me in nursery, it's same as if you just imagine, I mean, when you're young, and the nursery staff being able to sign as well. I think you're right. We have to focus on the
Yes,
0 to
0
5
to
years
5.
too,
Yeah,
because that is really the time when language acquisition is starting. The brain's like a sponge, and that's where
yeah,
the children will get the information. So maybe that is the thing that we're having to look into. So I agree with you,
exactly.
Rachel, in nurseries in Scotland. I mean, just out of curiosity, do you know if there's any nursery teachers in Scotland?
Yeah, some that are tied into deaf schools will have signing nurseries. There are a few. There are a few. Yeah,
Yeah, there's Hamilton as
Aberdeen
well.
has got one. There's a nursery there, but they're few and far between. I'd like
Well,
to
what
see
we want to
more.
see more. Yeah.
I'd like to see many more bilingual nurseries. I think that would be good.
And again, what we spoke about, having deaf
Yes.
nursery teachers, there's a double whammy because they then become a deaf role model too.
Yeah, role models, BSL, yeah, all of that available in nurseries.
So it would be good that there's more research put into the early years up to nursery education from birth, really. That would be good. And also, Rob had mentioned about doing more research and actually getting more empirical information from data from interviewing, whether it be teachers, or whoever else is out there that would be a stakeholder. Maybe it could be the health you would be getting involved as well, because there is
Well,
an impact.
that's interesting because health,
We have not
it's
thought
not
about that
really
before.
named in the Act. I mean, beyond cochlear
Okay.
implantation is not there really. It's missing. It's missing from the BSL Act. So when it went through Parliament, um, I think there are plans being created by regional health boards,
Mhm.
and the NHS, but I think cochlear implantation is not really mentioned in them. I think audiology departments aren't really part of the plan either. So these kind of details we
Well,
really need to look at.
maybe that's something that we have to look at in more detail. I cannot believe the time. Um, and we've only scratched the surface tonight. I mean, I was just picking out some questions. We've had loads coming in. Um, and we've given the link for deaf people to go and look at the report in BSL, and hopefully you'll be able to come back and give us part two in the future. So really, just over to both of you to say the stage is yours. What is your message that your message to give to our audience tonight? What would you like them to say or do?
I'd like to leave everyone with one overall message, and it's about the importance of communication
Okay.
in whatever form, and the responsibility under the BSL Act
Okay.
of national bodies or councils or whatever to be clear that
Yeah.
to be clear in their communication, because it's very difficult to find information, and that's not a good situation. So there's a lot of individuality in the way councils are representing this and the way they're in their process, and I'd like to see more unification on that. I'd like to see councils and bodies working together to provide effective results, if you know what I mean. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I
If
think
they're working together, they'll get the
so.
best
That's
use of
two
resources.
messages, isn't it? Two
Rachel, do you
messages from
agree?
me. Yeah, don't forget teaching and learning. It's the most important thing that happens in the classroom. How is it happening?
Rachel, can I just check? So you want to see more study happening around teaching and learning in the classroom research, or
What I mean is, remember I spoke before about the templates that the councils were using that
yes,
had been sent out by the Scottish Government. It doesn't talk about what's happening in the classroom. So we need to change that template to make sure that all the plans talk about the teaching and learning that's actually happening for deaf children who sign in the classroom. And I think that's a huge mistake and something we really need to address very quickly.
well, that's something that hopefully the local authorities will take on board and introduce that as part of their template. This has been such an amazing discussion. I am absolutely sure our audience at home have been so engaged by the looks of the questions coming in. Thank you to both of you for your
Well, I've
time
enjoyed it. Thank
tonight.
you.
And thank
Thank
you
you
for
for
being
inviting
to
me.
our audience at home for the questions. It's a bye
Thank
bye
you.
from us.
Bye.
Bye.